Max Archer is the 38-year-old father of an adult daughter and 3 school-aged boys. A nurse by training, he works from home for a major health insurance company, and in his spare time volunteers for several social justice organizations on Cape Cod. All this while pursuing an MBA in healthcare part-time. Max enjoys studying philosophy, loves science fiction, and a few years ago gave himself a new first name, Maxwell, after the character Maxwell Smart, the bumbling secret agent and star of the hit 1960s TV show Get Smart. So what prompted this quiet and introverted parent of 4 to give himself a new name? As Max explains it, it was just one of many steps he took in his years-long transition from being a woman to a man. In this interview with PFLAG's Rick Koonce, Max, a trans man, describes the many twists and turns in his transition from female to male, what he's learned about the subtleties of human sexuality in the process, and why he identifies so closely with the Klingon character of Worf on the hit TV show Star Trek: The Next Generation. Max, it's great to be talking with you today about your experience as a transgender person. You, I think, made your transition in 2017. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. I came out in December of 2017, and I started social and medical transitioning shortly thereafter.
And can you talk a little bit about what led up to that, the series of events or life turns that sort of got you to that point?
Sure. So when I look back, I don't think there was any one specific event that kind of led me to my complete realization. I've known I was different since probably about the age of 9, but growing up in the 80s, we didn't really have any knowledge of what being transgender was. I knew what being gay or lesbian was, but I didn't know that someone could identify as a different gender. I just knew that I felt different from other people. So the feeling kind of got a little stronger the older I got, but I didn't really know anything about it until I was in my 20s and the internet existed more, and there was very little exposure to that as a youngster. There were a few depictions in movies and TV, but it was mostly trans women, and they weren't always viewed in the most positive light. So it wasn't until I was a little older and was able to really look into myself that I finally came to be able to admit it to myself without feeling ashamed or without feeling that there was no possibility that that could really be how I feel. I pushed it away a lot in my teens and 20s.
It sounds like you didn't have the vocabulary or the reference points in your teens to know really what you were feeling.
Exactly. There was no reference point for me to really know what it was that I felt.
Did you feel alone, as if nobody else could identify with what you were feeling?
Oh, definitely. I felt very alone.
And would you say that's pretty common for people who sense something different about themselves?
I can't speak for everyone else, but I would say yes, it probably is a very separate feeling that makes you feel like you are alone.
Growing up, you were born into a female body, but you've told me that from a relatively early age, you really didn't identify with girls. You identified more with boys. And can you talk a little bit about what those feelings were and what you did as part of identifying more with boys?
Sure. So I remember starting to feel different mostly around the age of 9. And I just felt like I couldn't really relate to other girls. I always identified more with the masculine body. When I would play make believe, I would always be, one of the male characters. I tended to gravitate more toward traditionally, boy toys or boy TV shows, but I did also play with some girl toys and watch some girl TV shows. It was just more that I felt more comfortable and like I understood the boy-oriented ones more.
It sounds to me as if part of what was going on throughout your teenage years and maybe into your early 20s, you were really in search of yourself, it sounds
Yes.
like.
Yes, I
And
was.
and I think you told me that you actually went through a kind of a girly phase.
I went through multiple girly phases because
Tell
that
talk about those a little bit.
Sure. So I went through multiple throughout my teens, 20s, and even into my 30s before, because I didn't come out till I was 35, almost 36. So I would, with no reference point, I felt like since I was born a woman, any feelings otherwise was just weird or just not acceptable, I guess you could say. So I would go through periods of trying to overcompensate for my feelings. So I would
Mm.
dress very feminine and feel absolutely miserable. Even though I got lots of compliments for it, like, oh, you're so pretty, or blah, 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 you should dress like that more often. I got lots of comments in that aspect, but it made me feel even worse. So I would then start dressing how I felt more comfortable again. And it just went on and on in a cycle, like a hyper feminine cycle, and then a more masculine cycle where I felt more comfortable. And that happened quite constantly through my teens, 20s, and into my 30s. Even when I started to know what transgender was as a term through my research in my 20s, starting in my 20s, I started researching it on the internet, and I would have feelings like, oh, in the back of my head, I would be like, oh, that sounds a lot like me. But then I would be like, no, that can't be right. And I would push it away and then start the hyper feminine phase over again.
It's interesting. It's as if you really were going through a cycle of exploration and then maybe pulling back and then trying to, as you say, overcompensate and be more feminine. And it sounds to me as if it was part of the journey to self acceptance.
Oh, it definitely was because it was like a puzzle. I had to slowly put the pieces together before the whole picture was completed. Not everyone is like that. Some people, they come out when they're 3 or 4 and they are absolutely adamant and they're consistent throughout their whole lives. I was a little different in that department. It took me a while to feel comfortable acknowledging my male reality.
Max, I know that other transgender persons often find sources of support in a school with a counselor or at home with a parent. What were the family circumstances in which you found yourself, and how did they contribute to your coming out process? I guess what I'm asking is, as a child, did you feel supported? Were you
Oh
able to
yes,
talk?
as a child, I really, since I couldn't put words to what I was feeling, I couldn't really talk about it to my parents, but my parents were very open-minded, so they didn't ever tell me that I couldn't dress the way I wanted to dress, and they didn't ever tell me that I couldn't play with the toys I wanted to play with.
Hmm.
So I was fully encouraged to play with the Ninja Turtle toys or the Ghostbuster toys, or because I had a huge obsession in Ninja Turtles when I was, 9, 10 years old, and that was never frowned upon. They never told me that I had to be in they had to be a cheerleader and wear dresses and all that. They were very open to me expressing myself as how I felt comfortable. So I think that was a huge, huge help when I was little.
You've also talked about some of the inspirations that you took from television and action figures and so forth. And I also know that you're a big Star Trek fan, right?
Oh yes, I'm a huge Trekkie.
And was Captain Kirk an inspiration to you growing up, or Captain Picard from Star Trek Next Generation?
Yeah, I grew up more with Next Generation, and I loved Captain Picard. The character I always loved the most, though, was Worf, the Klingon on the crew.
Talk about that.
I always loved Worf just because his character he's a very honorable, brave, stoic figure. Like the whole Klingon race is that way, but Worf takes it to an extra level because he was raised by humans, so he overcompensates for his Klingonness. So I think in a way I identified with him just because he was raised by humans and
Yes.
he was Klingon. So he had a completely different set of instincts than what he was raised with. So he overcompensated for his Klingonness and became very reserved and quiet. Klingons are not quiet. They're not quiet at all. They sing, they party, they laugh a lot, and
Hard
Worf
living.
is not like that. Exactly. They live hard and they want to die hard an honorable death. So I just always identified with Worf just because of that.
Well, I too am a Star Trek TNG fan. And for anyone who's listening to this podcast who is not a Star Trek fan, I always thought, Max, that Worf was a little bit of an outsider.
Oh, definitely. Yes.
And so I'm wondering if maybe there might have been some identification that you felt with him. You
Mhm.
could empathize with the shoes in which he walked.
Yes. Yep, definitely with him and even with Data too, because Data is trying to navigate an emotional world where he feels no emotion. So he's an outsider too. He wants to have that human experience, but he can't. And no matter how close he gets to it, he can never fully attain it until he got the emotion chip. But I won't go on that tangent.
Well, for you, feeling like an outsider, it sounds like for a while growing up, you felt a little bit like that, and you didn't really have a roadmap. You had to kind of figure your way through your adolescence and gain insights here and there where they when and where they came along. I'm curious, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions that people who are not trans have about people who are?
I would say some of the biggest misconceptions would be that being transgender is a mental illness, that being transgender is a choice. We don't, wake up one day and, I didn't wake up one day and be like, oh, hey, I'm going to be a man. It's just who I am. I was born this way. And I would say another misconception that some people have is that it's a phase. There are some children that in their exploration of themselves, or even adults. There are some people that do detransition, but it is a very, 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 very small percentage. It's just all part of the human experience. So for the majority of trans people, it is not a phase, it's who we are.
And in the course of your own journey, you have you've walked many roads and taken many turns. You, for example, have four children. You have a
Hmm.
daughter and three sons. And I believe you had your daughter in your teens, right?
Yes, I was 17 when I had my daughter.
And then you later got married. And I'm wondering, how did being married and having children, how did that factor into your journey?
It had more to do with trying to live the role as a woman because, in my mind, the female experience, not everyone wants to get married and have children, but my way of compensating for that was to get married and have children.
And today you have four lovely children.
Yes, I do.
And we don't need to go into all the particulars, but it's such a wonderful story about how you came up with your new name. And what would you care to share about how you came up with your new name when you
Oh,
transitioned?
sure. So, my first name, Maxwell, I actually have loved the name Maxwell since I was a child because I grew up watching Nick at Night on Nickelodeon, and that had a lot of the older TV shows. And one of them was Get Smart, and the main character was Maxwell Smart, and I loved that. I still love that show. It's hilarious, and I really loved the name Maxwell, and that's where I got that name from. And then my middle and last names I got from my kids. I told them that I wanted them all to try to think of names that were mixes of their own names. And then I would make that my middle and last name.
Lovely. And talk about your kids now and your lives together. You're a single parent during the time of the pandemic, raising four kids. What is that like?
Well, my oldest has been gone for a while. She is 21 and she's married. So she lives across the country at this point. So it's just me with my three boys. And I think we're doing well. They navigate school and I work from home. So not really much has changed in that aspect because I know a lot of parents that work out of the home, they've had to juggle learning how to work in the home. For me, that wasn't a huge transition because I work from home regardless. And I'm lucky to have amazing kids that are very self-sufficient. So they've been able to integrate themselves into the online schooling as well.
And they know the backstory of you, correct?
Yes, they do.
And how did you share with them, and how have you had conversations with them about being transgender?
My kids really just kind of took it in stride. I mean, I just kind of sat them down at dinner one day and I just told them the truth. I was like, I've been struggling with this for a long time, but I've come to realization that I am transgender. My kids always come first for me, so this is one thing that also differs from other transgender people. Some people they have to transition, and for me, I really wanted to transition, but I did tell them that if they were not comfortable with it, I would wait until they were older. It wouldn't have been ideal for me, but I didn't want to make them feel uncomfortable, especially with them being minors. So I did give them that choice. And I think it helped them because they had a little bit of control of the issue. And they all said they didn't mind.
Yes.
My oldest son even said he kind of had suspicions that I was. So for him, it wasn't a surprise.
And I think, Max, you probably have some great experience with knowing how to navigate school systems and anything that involves a parent with children. And can you talk a little bit about that? And how do you, what do the schools know? And how have you broached this topic with them, if at all, and also with healthcare providers, that kind of thing?
Since we live in such a liberal and accepting state, it's been a fairly good experience for me in all those aspects because it's really never been questioned or, looked down upon. Pretty much when I changed my name, I just had to go to all their schools and fill out a new identification form and just show them the court paperwork that my name had legally changed. So it was luckily a pretty smooth process with the schools and their doctors.
Now, I know that you said that growing up, your parents said they really let you be who you wanted to be.
Mhm.
I'm sensing, though, it must have taken courage to come out to them. Can you talk a little bit about that and other people to whom you found yourself coming out to?
Sure. So, my kids were the ones I came out to first because my three sons were the ones I came out to first because I live with them. The next person I came out to was my mom because I feel very close to her. As far as coming out to my family, I was very lucky. No one, some of my family had a really hard time with it, more extended family.
Hmm. And how has that come about? Has it taken time and talk and
Um,
patience and conversation?
Not really conversation on the most part because it was more my mom is more of a reader, so she loves to read. So I think she read a few books on the subject. We didn't really talk about it much outside of when I came out to her and when I talked about how testosterone was not going to change me
Hmm.
inwardly because she was afraid of losing me as a person.
Hmm.
And I had to reassure her that when I started testosterone, I was not going to change as a person. I was just going to be more comfortable with myself, and
Hmm.
but my inner self, my core self, was not going to change.
It wasn't going to change. And
Mhm.
based on your experience, Max, what's your advice to other transgender persons about how and when to come out to parents or family or loved ones?
That depends on their family, and it depends on their comfort level. There is no perfect time. It's when they feel comfortable coming out to their family. I would suggest coming out to someone you trust first, because that person could help you with navigating other family members. If there's a family or a friend that someone trusts more than other people and feels more bonded to or closer to or accepted by, I would come out to them first so they could act as a support through the whole process. And I also recommend, I think coming out in a letter or by email is sometimes better. Again, it depends on all circumstances, but I just think that a letter or email sometimes works better because, coming out is a big thing. And some people have reactions that are, just instinctual or instantaneous or impulsive reactions that
Hmm.
don't think about. So if you do it through email or a letter, it at least gives people some time to digest and process the news so that maybe their reaction wouldn't be as harsh.
And I would imagine that after coming out in that way or face to face, the family, loved ones, parents will have questions, right? And
Hmm.
I'm imagining, and maybe if you can talk a little bit about this, Max, is I think sometimes, again, people who are not familiar or who don't know any transgender people sometimes confuse gender dysphoria, gender fluidity, and sexual orientation. And can you kind of provide for people a little bit of a distinction among those three things?
Sure. So I think the most important thing to remember is that, or remember and learn, is that gender identity and sexual attraction, sexual orientation are two totally different things. Gender identity is the gender that you identify as,
Hmm.
be it male, female, non binary, gender fluid. There are
Yes.
others. And sexual orientation is the gender or non binary that you are attracted to. So with that said, gender dysphoria is loosely defined, would be a discomfort with your birth sex as opposed to the gender that you really are. For me, as
Hmm.
a trans man, I was born female, so I have dysphoria, gender dysphoria toward the female body that I was born with.
Hmm.
Gender fluidity is or gender fluid is another term that can fit under the transgender umbrella because transgender just really means you don't identify with the gender that you were born with, the sex that you were assigned at birth.
Hmm.
So, someone who is gender fluid, their gender identity tends to fluctuate between male, female, or even non binary. So, there could be times that they feel more female, there could be times that male, and there could be times that they feel more just kind of non-binary. But there's a huge range of gender fluid people too, so I can't fully, because I'm not gender fluid, so I can't fully
Hmm.
give a good explanation of it beyond that. And like I said, sexual orientation is the gender that you are attracted to.
That was wonderfully put in terms of the distinctions. And it really points up that human sexuality is so complex, right?
Yes,
And
it definitely
also
is.
and people really exist, it would seem to me, and this goes back to Kenzie, to the idea that sexuality is on a continuum.
Yes.
And so, if I may, sort of to go just a little bit deeper here on this.
Hmm.
So, in your case, and if I may ask, I know you're not involved romantically with anybody right now. If and when that occurs in the future, what gender will you be attracted to, or what gender identity will you be attracted to?
I've been single for about 10 years. So
Mm.
I honestly don't fully know, but I'm not big on labels. So, but if I had to put a word to it, I would guess that I'm probably pansexual, which means that I am more attracted to someone's mind than
Mm.
than their body. I look more into the human soul and their minds. Like, would I resonate with someone on that level?
Mm.
That's more what I think I would look for.
Mm. Mm. I'm thinking, Max, you're sharing some really wonderful things here, and you've had this really, really interesting journey. It's a heroic journey of searching and exploration and finding yourself. At some point along the way, you found PFLAG and
Mm,
other resources. Can you talk a little bit about what PFLAG has meant to you, how it has been helpful to you, and also about other organizations, perhaps, or resources that would be of
sure.
value for any transgender person to become aware of?
Sure. So I absolutely love PFLAG. It is an amazing organization. I have found a lot of support in PFLAG, and I even feel good that I've been able to provide support to other people. If parents come in and their child has just come out as transgender, I love being able to share my experience with them, and I hope that it helps them feel more at ease. So for me, PFLAG has just been a huge support. Also, it makes me feel good that I'm able to give back because it's important for me to be able to give back. There are many other organizations or resources for family members and other transgender people. For a medical perspective, there's Fenway Health. Fenway Health has support groups as well for transgender people.
In Boston, right?
Yep, in Boston. But there's also a support group for transgender people that's on the Cape for under Fenway. There is a group that meets in Boston for trans masculine people. It's called Compass. And another group is called PCNE, that's Transgender Club of New England. They also have workshops and support groups. And actually, our PFLAG Cape Cod page does have a transgender and LGBTQ resource list, which has many other groups or organizations which someone could reach out to.
Well, it's interesting to me, Max, as we talk, that in addition to being a single parent, you're pursuing an MBA.
Mm-hmm.
You're involved with our PFLAG chapter here
Yes.
on Cape Cod, and you're also involved as an activist with some other groups, right? Can you talk a little
Mm-hmm.
bit about that?
Sure. So I'm also a member of the No Place for Hate group in Plymouth, and I'm also on the Plymouth Public Schools Diversity Committee. So the Plymouth No Place for Hate group, we have different events throughout the year. Some of our big ones are Martin Luther King Breakfast, and we also work with other groups for Yom HaShoah. It's a Holocaust Remembrance Vigil. And we're starting to branch out more. We're becoming more proactive instead of reactive. In the past, the Plymouth No Place for Hate, we also work closely with other groups in Plymouth. We work closely with the Plymouth Police Department. We work with the library. We work with the Women League of Voters. We work with a group called PICA, which is a group of clergy from different faiths in Plymouth that also work together. So in the past, we used to kind of just be reactive to situations, but we're starting to work with other groups to be more proactive, to either sponsor or work in conjunction with some other groups to have events that help promote equality, understanding. And back in February, we had a panel, which actually Joe was part of. Our PFLAG president was part of that panel, and we helped sponsor that with the Plymouth Women's League of Voters, which there were panel members from many different minority areas that were interviewed. We also recently worked with a couple other area groups, and we had like a bunch of speakers. It was toward like the Black Lives Matter movement. It was a bunch of speakers came and spoke about racial healing and topics related to that. So we do a lot of work along those lines.
Well, and we're both lucky to live in such a progressive state, right?
Yes. Oh,
Where
I
these
definitely.
these things can take place. Well, just a couple of other questions, Max, and you've really shared some wonderful things here. When you look back on your journey and when you think about other people out there who might be listening to this podcast who are struggling with their gender identity or just sensing that there's something not quite right with them, first of all, what's your advice to them? And secondly, how can a person who feels that way practice good self-care and fortify their self-esteem for the journey of exploration and acceptance?
Mm. So I think one of the biggest things along both parts of that is just be patient with yourself and be kind to yourself, because it's a big life step to begin your transition. So I think therapy is very important. I had been seeing a therapist for almost a year before I was fully able to come out to myself. So I think therapy is very important. I think being part of a support group of some form or another is also very beneficial, because it's good to feel that you have others that can relate to you. I think it's so you don't feel as alone and as isolated. So if you have others that you can relate to, it can also help with your journey. And there are many groups out there, more than I mentioned, like I said before, on the Cape Cod PFLAG or even the Greater Boston PFLAG website, depending on where you live in Massachusetts. There are many other groups that people can look into. There are many youth groups, for LGBT youth. Schools usually have GSAs, And then there's groups for people that are 18 and over. So there's a huge array of different groups that people can look into. And I think having that camaraderie and that support is a huge help for people.
I agree. And for anyone who doesn't know, GSA is Gay Straight Alliances, and
Yeah.
they're pretty common in schools throughout Massachusetts. Is that fair to say?
I would say so. I think a good majority of the schools on the Cape have one, and I know that the schools here in Plymouth, the high schools at least, have one. I know the high schools have them, and the middle school does have a GSA group.
Max, is there anything, we've had a great conversation, is there anything that I have not asked you about, but that has come up for you as we've talked that you think would be pertinent for our listeners to hear?
I just think the biggest thing that people need to realize, because it has been well documented that most people, there's a big majority of people that don't know anyone who's transgender. So a lot of people's views of transgender people is what they get from the news or, from Hollywood. And that's not always accurate. So I think it's just important for people to not hold those misconceptions about transgender people, that we're just people. We're just regular people that work and have families and pay our taxes and just do everything that normal people do. So I just think education is power, and it can lead to understanding. So I just think it's important for people to educate themselves on trans issues or any LGBTQ issues, because maybe there's people out there. I know even sexual orientation isn't fully accepted in all places. So I just think it's important for people to educate themselves in order to gain understanding and acceptance.
Well said. Very well said. Well, Max Archer, I want to thank you for taking time to talk with me today. Very interesting interview. We covered a lot of bases here. I think what you've had to say will be of great value to people who listen to this podcast. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's interview. Founded in 1973, PFLAG is the first and largest organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people and their parents, families, friends, and allies. We have over 400 chapters and more than 200,000 members and supporters nationwide. Our members come from every generation and live in cities, small towns, and rural areas across the United States. PFLAG is committed to creating a world where diversity is celebrated and all people are respected, valued, and affirmed. For more information about PFLAG, explore the rest of this website or visit PFLAG National at pflag.org.